Welcome everyone to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. We are going to start off with the interesting story that came out at ESPN yesterday. Chris Lowe had a very interesting piece about the 49-hour coaching period, search period that Alabama dealt with after Saban decided to retire. Then we're going to get into some spring ball. There's spring practices coming up very shortly, so we got a ton of questions to answer. And then we'll get into some conference championship odds. We had some odds come out from FanDuel recently, so wanted to break down some different teams up at the top and then some dark horses to watch throughout the year. And then we have a hot take Thursday. This one is very, very hot, and I'm sure there will be plenty of people that disagree with me, but I think that's the fun of it. So definitely a great show, so stick around for the end for that. But before we start, I do want to remind you all that we get a ton of questions throughout the show, and the best way for you to see your questions on the screen and we can have a fun back and forth here is to use the link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a super huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all to see your questions on the screen, and we can have a fun back and forth. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. Alrighty, let's jump right in because Chris Lowe at ESPN had a very, very interesting article about what happened at Bama recently and the coaching search that opened up and the 49-hour period he had to fill that coaching search. So, ton went into this piece. There's a ton of very interesting parts of this piece, but let's go through the highlights real quick. So Greg Byrne apparently in 2022, after that season, was told by Nick Saban that he was slowing down, that there was going to be an end to his career. He wasn't sure exactly when that was going to be, but there were people that were aware that this might be the last run for Saban before going into the 2023 season. So that's kind of an interesting development that we didn't know before. We thought, at least from what we had heard, it was all very sudden and a rash decision in some ways, but obviously Nick Saban doesn't do much things rash, so he obviously took the time to figure out what was best for him, and he finally came to the decision that retirement was what he should do. So, but also a lot of things contributed to that leading up to the very end of his time there. Nick Saban dealt with some interesting reactions after the Rose Bowl that he was not used to. He said he didn't love some of the immediate reactions in the stadium from some of the players, and then it only hurt more when they got back to Tuscaloosa because there were a number of kids, he said about 70 to 80% of the team, that was worried about their starting time next year or how much money they could be making next year and things that Saban didn't want to worry about. Saban felt like they not necessarily didn't care, I don't want to say that obviously, but I think he was taking it a little bit harder than the rest of the people in the room, and I think that frustrated him a little bit. But he got the feeling that relationships and the things that he has been incredibly good at developing and has kept him in the sport for so long were kind of deteriorating. He felt like they didn't hold the same weight that they used to, and with someone like Saban, that's what he does really well, is create relationships with these guys. So obviously that was something that he was not enthused by any means. He did say that that is not necessarily the reason that he retired, NIL, the transfer portal, all of that different stuff. But there were a lot of confounding factors, and that was obviously one of them. So he also felt that replacing the coaches that would walk out of the program every year to get promotions and things of that nature was getting tougher and tougher as he got older and older. So it's not necessarily surprising that all of this happened, but it is interesting to see kind of the last couple of days as he came to make this decision. So, but apparently shortly after that, Nick Saban went on his one vacation of the year, much like other college coaches, and him and the famous Miss Terry that we all love so much, they went down to Florida and he had some conversations with Bill Parcells and Gene Stallings. Gene Stallings, obviously a Bama legend, and Bill Parcells, one of the most respected coaches in the history of football. So got a lot of advice from very, very good people, and they all basically said there's no right time to retire. There's no right time to hang him up and to decide you're moving on, but you kind of know at a certain point. So he felt like he kind of knew, but he came back to Tuscaloosa and he went on as business as usual. He kind of did his thing, as Saban does. He kind of handled everything very, very responsibly, very maturely, and went on business as usual because that's the way he works. He's going to work until the very last day. There's no two ways about that. So he kind of went on as business as usual, and the people around him thought it was business as usual with no problem. But eventually he came to the decision, told Greg Byrne, and then the onus was on him. There was a lot of pressure on him, obviously. Replacing someone like Nick Saban is not an easy task by any means. It is remarkably tough to do something like that, and he had to get as much input as possible. So we called guys like Mark Ingram, Joe Namath, Devontae Smith, and Jalen Hurts, all guys that were very important to Alabama, that had played their own part in different kind of eras of Alabama, to just get their thoughts. Not necessarily, give me a name that you really want to be the head coach, but just kind of go through what they thought about what exactly he was replacing, who Nick Saban was on the field, who he was off the field, and what the traits are for the next guy that was going to come through the door. So after those conversations, it seemed that he kind of zeroed in on two guys, Mike Norvell and Kalen DeBoer. So all the talk about, Lane Kiffin or Dabo Sweeney or Steve Sarkisian, none of them were really aggressively considered. It seemed like Steve Sarkisian, the talk around Alabama was just, he's not leaving Texas, so it's not really worth the call. So that totally makes sense. I think it would have taken a lot to pull Sark away from Texas right now as he's kind of heating up. So, but the two real candidates are obviously incredible candidates. Mike Norvell coming off the incredible year that he had with Florida State, and then Kalen DeBoer playing in the national title game against Michigan a year ago. So two incredible names, two guys that I think any team would be happy to have. But it ended up coming down to Kalen DeBoer. But there was a certain amount of time, I don't necessarily know how long, but Florida State upper management, or the athletic department and the people that make the decisions around there, were genuinely worried that he was going to make his way to Tuscaloosa, Mike Norvell that is. So they had started making some different plans of who their next head coach was going to be, because as we know, all of this has to happen very, very quickly in today's age. So they had zeroed in apparently on none other than Lane Kiffin to possibly take over Florida State if he had left. That would have been a very weird world. We would have been dealing with a lot of different transfer portal news and things happening that none of us had foreseen going into the offseason. So very, very interesting what if there. But Mike Norvell eventually decided to stay in Tallahassee. He got a massive raise, much like Steve Sarkisian and Dan Lanning did while all of this news came out. But it looked like for a second there, Lane Kiffin could have been the next Noles head coach, which would have been very interesting to say the least. But DeBoer really had no idea that this was any of this was happening behind the scenes. Obviously, you're all the way up in Washington. You don't necessarily have ties to Alabama, so no reason that he would necessarily know that Saban was considering retirement. So he got a call on Wednesday and took the job on Friday. So just to give everyone an idea of how quickly all this stuff happens, it was Wednesday was first contact, Thursday was the interview, and then Friday he was offered and accepted the job. So all of this happened very, very quickly, and all of it kind of had to happen quickly. And DeBoer talked about that in this article as well, where he didn't want to leave Washington the way that he left. He didn't necessarily envision leaving Washington this offseason, but when someone like Bama calls, you take the call and you at least give it some real thought, because even taking over for Saban, which is a job that is incredibly tough, that I think there are a number of coaches across the country that would have said no, that would have kind of shied away from the challenge. But as DeBoer said to Chris Lowe in this article, he just couldn't say no to the challenge. So it gives you an idea of who they're getting. Bama in Kalen DeBoer, he is a guy that is obviously not afraid of anything. He is taking on what possibly is the toughest situation in all of sports right now, which is taking over for the best coach of all time in Saban. So a lot of very, very interesting points in this article, a lot of different turns. Lane Kiffin going to Florida State would have been one of the weirder turns of this offseason and would have made this coaching cycle that's already been off the walls even crazier. But some general thoughts about this. Saban was Saban up until the very end. He refused to stop working. He refused to take a chill day off and think about retirement. He came right back in. He started to go to work again like business as usual. And that's what Tommy Rees said. He didn't feel like there was any difference really with the way he's going about business. And that's why he's the best to ever do it. There is certain people that will never let outside stuff kind of affect what's going on in the building. And Saban was never going to let that happen. So it was very, very cool, obviously, and shows you who he was and what he was to this sport. And then on the Greg Burns side, the Alabama AD, he was put in an impossible situation. I think everyone across the country that is an athletic director or just a decision maker in these athletic departments did not necessarily praise Greg Burns' position in this, because it's nearly impossible. But he did a remarkable job dealing with all this. Remarkable turnaround. Obviously, 49 hours is not easy amount of time to replace the GOAT, but he was able to do it. Took suggestions from former players that all of the Alabama fans love and can support, so I think that's a huge plus. And then he got an absolute dude in Kalen DeBoer. He got a dude that can obviously coach with the best of them, has had great success, and has made his way up from the NAIA ranks very quickly, way quicker than most people do. I think about a decade ago, he was an NAIA coach, and now he is the Alabama head coach. So just to give you an idea of how incredible this journey has been for Kalen DeBoer and the type of person he is. It is not easy to get promotions in this sport, and Kalen DeBoer able to do it as quickly as he has just been remarkable to watch. But the most interesting piece of news, and the one that everyone is always talking about now, is Lane Kiffin possibly at Florida State. If that were to happen and Mike Norvell went on to Alabama, first of all, Bama would be getting a great head coach in Mike Norvell. I don't think there's any question about that. But also, there's a real reality where a lot of guys that are currently in Oxford, Mississippi would have made their way down to Tallahassee. I think Jackson Dart chief among them. He would have been probably on the first plane down there because so much of his success has been tied to Lincoln Riley in that offense. So it would have been a very different spring. We would have been dealing with a lot of different players bouncing around to a lot of different places. But everything worked out the way it worked out. Kalen DeBoer is the head coach of Alabama. And I think it's a great hire. I think they nailed it. I've said this a number of times. We don't know if he's going to succeed. I know he's a very confident person. I know he's real with his players. I know he's up for the challenge, but you never know if someone's going to succeed until they get into the job, right? It's impossible to really get an idea of what the future looks like at Alabama, but you know you have a guy that's not afraid of this challenge, that's not going to hesitate in making decisions that need to be made, and you got one of the best football coaches in all of the country. So I think there's a ton to like about this hire. We obviously won't know until the games start what is going to happen with all of this, but as of right now, I would feel very good if I was a Bama fan. And then finally, there was obviously a lot of transfer portal stuff, and Kalen DeBoer said that's, obviously not what you want to deal with, but he thinks they have a lot of really good guys in the building that can help them succeed right away. And I think the main guys that were touched on in this article and, deserve a ton of respect because they stayed in Tuscaloosa, because that's not necessarily an easy decision to make with a ton of coaches leaving and a lot of things changing, but Jalen Milroe, Malachi Moore, Tyler Booker, Jahad Campbell, Deontay Lawson, all of these guys sticking around in Alabama and being the leaders of this team going into this year gives Kalen DeBoer a massive leg up on anyone else that was going to take this job, because Jalen Milroe, to start, obviously the leader of the offense, the leader of the team in a lot of ways, and then Malachi Moore, probably the leader of the defense in a lot of ways. So it's incredible to have, at the very least, a number of guys on either side of the ball that have this love for Alabama and this love for the city of Tuscaloosa and want to, wear the crimson for the rest of their college career. So although, Kalen DeBoer is taking over a remarkably hard job and kind of put in an impossible position, he has tons of support from his players and, the leaders on this team. And I think at the very least, he's set up very well to succeed as quickly as possible. So a ton of very interesting things came out of that article. I think a lot of people were not expecting the Lane Kiffin at Florida State possibility, but at the end of the day, coaching searches are all over the place, and they're going to go a number of different directions. So not necessarily surprising there were some twists and turns that we didn't know about. But that'll do it for this segment, and we will come back here after a little break and talk about some questions going into spring. There is a ton of change, like we just talked about, and there's a ton of questions for all the teams out there that are either changing conferences or changing coaches. So we will talk about all the questions that we have right after this.